Thank you all for coming out on a very smoky day. I'm sure our speaker will clear the air for us in many ways. And welcome to the second meeting of the Global Security Policy Lecture Series. This is a new lecture series that is intended to focus on issues of global security policy, especially those related and at the intersection of science and technology. My name is Robert Powell, and I'm a professor in the political science department, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me call your attention to three upcoming talks that may be of interest. Our own Professor Jennifer Doudna will be speaking and giving this year's Elberg Lecture on Thursday, February 21st. And she'll be discussing some of the policy and security issues growing out of CRISPR and gene editing. Admiral James Stavridis is this year's Nimitz Lecturer and will be speaking on Wednesday, March 6th on The Voyage of Character. And General Michael Hayden, former director of the National Security Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency, will be on campus on Thursday, August 18th. For more information about these, you can look at the Institute for International Studies website. As for today, I can't think of a more important and timely topic than the North Korean nuclear program, nor a better person to discuss it than today's speaker. Professor Siegfried Hecker is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Management Science and Engineering and Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Spogli Institute for International Studies, both at Stanford. He was director of Los Alamos National Laboratory from 1986 to 1997 and played a key role in fostering cooperation between the Russian nuclear laboratories, American nuclear laboratories, securing and safeguarding fissile material after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Professor Hecker is also one of the world's leading experts on the North Korean nuclear program. He has made 7 trips to North Korea and is one of the few, possibly the only Westerner to have held a jar of North Korean plutonium in his hands. His topic for today is there a light at the end of the North Korean tunnel? Professor Hecker, thank you for coming to Berkeley and welcome back. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great pleasure to be back at Berkeley. Also, special thanks to my friend Harold Smith, who introduced me to this lecture series or its predecessors some years ago. And indeed, during the time I was working at Los Alamos and with the Russians, we worked very closely with Harold's office in the Pentagon at that time. So, as for the title, after driving over here, I think the best we can hope for at the end of the nuclear tunnel is smoke. So it's going to be a long haul. So what I want to do is I do want to address the current situation as to where we are with North Korea, what the prospects are of getting out of this very complicated nuclear dilemma we have with North Korea. But before doing so, and especially since I'm at a university, I want to sort of give you the background, and particularly my colleagues and I at Stanford have put together what we call a comprehensive history of North Korean nuclear program. And in fact, Elliot Serban, one of my colleagues, is here with me. The other one, Bob Carlin, is actually off in East Asia right now. So what I want to do in terms of introduction is to talk just a little bit about why does North Korea want nuclear weapons in the first place, and then what do they actually have, or at least as best as we can determine it, and then how and when did they get it before we try to address the issue, so what can we do about it? So that's what I'm going to try to take you through. So why does he want nuclear weapons? Well, he said, the deterrent to defeat aggression. That's what he said. It's a powerful deterrent for his country. Is that so unusual? Well, I don't think so, because if you look at the two leaders of the world, President Trump, and in the latest nuclear posture review, it says nuclear weapons above all are to deter adversaries. And then Russia, actually, if you followed what Russia has done, the last 6 years or so, I mean, Putin's gone over the top. He not only says, under no circumstances are we going to surrender our strategic deterrent, but in 2018 he said, we have developed weapons, nuclear weapons, that are years, then he added, no, decades ahead of our adversaries. So if you got guys like this bragging about nuclear weapons and needing them, it's not so much of a surprise that Kim Jong-un may decide they could be useful. There's another side of that. The other side is not having nuclear weapons. And this is what's happened. If we could actually dim the front lights maybe a bit more, whoever is taking care of things, just to make sure you can really see the photographs. I have a lot of photographs. So you know what happened. Saddam Hussein, he met death at the gallows. Milosevic, in Serbia, he was taken to the International Criminal Court. He died in a NATO prison. And on the right, it was Gaddafi, who first decided to give up his nuclear weapons, and then he faced sort of the worst deaths of them all. Pretty grim. And then down at the bottom, we have Assad. And we don't know yet what's going to happen to Assad. He actually tried to get nuclear weapons a decade or so ago. And just to emphasize the point, about the threat from a North Korean perspective, you remember a little over a year ago, President Trump said we'll have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. And he called him the Rocket Man, being on a suicide mission. And then, in terms of what this sort of characterizes their potential. This is one big ICBM, the thing we call the Hwasong 15. That was launched just about a year ago. So as I now take you into, so what do they actually have? Being in an educational institution, I know to people like Bruce Goodwin and others, this is a bit of an insult to go through the basics like this, but I'd like to explain to people, look, if you're going to talk about nuclear weapons and what they have, you should make sure they understand there are three things that you need. One, you need the bomb fuel. And for the fission or atomic bombs, as we call them, so that's plutonium or highly enriched uranium. If you want to make a hydrogen bomb, then you need the isotopes of hydrogen, namely tritium, deuterium, or there's this really neat compound, lithium-6 deuterite, that makes its own tritium when you need it. So you need the bomb fuel, and that's pretty difficult to do. And then you need to weaponize, and what I mean by weaponize here is to design, to build, and to test nuclear weapons. For that, you certainly have to know some physics. You got to do computation, high explosives, and all the things that I list here in order to build and then eventually to test the bomb. And then you have to deliver it. And of course, the only two bombs ever to be used in war at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were delivered by one B-59 plane each. Today, the method of choice are missiles. So in North Korea, the nuclear materials, that governs how big the arsenal is. It's not so for the United States, because we've got so much plutonium, we don't need that many weapons, and the same goes, or highly enriched uranium, the same goes for Russia. But for North Korea, that governs the size. The center part sort of governs the sophistication. Is it a hydrogen bomb or is it an atomic bomb? And then a third is pretty much what threat that it poses. In other words, a missile, is a big threat. An ICBM, of course, would be a threat to this country. So when you talk about what does a country have, one of the most important questions to ask is, how do you know? Particularly when it comes to North Korea, how do you know? We like to call it the black hole, in the international system. Nothing gets out of there. Well, it turns out it's not quite true. And all of you are aware of the fact that today one has commercial overhead imagery. That used to be the purview of the spy agencies. Well, it isn't any longer. You can buy commercial satellite imagery about any place on Earth, and this is the most watched place on the whole Earth, and that is North Korea. And particularly here, I just used the example of a collage of the construction of what they call their experimental light water reactor. That was begun in 2010, which was actually my last of the 7 visits that I've made to North Korea. And so it looked like the center picture on top. And then we watched it, with commercial satellite imagery, and by 2013, it was finished. But it's still not operating today. Well, so, you can't see through those places. So you'd have to get inside. Well, it turns out there are people like me who've gotten inside. For a variety of reasons, the North Koreans had decided it would be to their advantage to actually have me visit the nuclear facilities. And here I am in their glove box laboratory. It was like at home at Los Alamos when I started there as a summer student in 1965. Glove boxes look pretty much like that. So they let me in. And it's not only that you see the facilities, but what's really important, you get to talk to the people. And that actually teaches you even more than just seeing the facilities. And I've had the chance to do that. In fact, as Bob pointed out, I've been there 7 times. These are just photos from my first 6 visits to North Korea. The one on the upper left was really crucial in 2004. My first visit, January 2004. Neil Jock remembers that well because he was sitting in the National Security Council sort of asking, hey, what the hell is Hecker doing going to North Korea? Well, Hecker went to try to find out whether those fuel rods, 8,000 of them that were sitting in that pool that international and U.S. inspectors had been following, whether they were still there. Because in January of 2003, North Korea withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, restarted their nuclear reactor, and said they would reprocess. But our intel agencies didn't know for sure whether they actually reprocessed. So they took me into that facility, and it was a fantastic, interesting visit. The bottom line was, yeah, they reprocessed. They took me through their reprocessing facility, and that's the time when I was still sort of skeptical, and they said, would you like to see our product? We're sitting in a conference room. And I said, you mean the plutonium? And they said, well, yes. I said, sure, bring it in. I've done plutonium. I'm still alive. And so they brought in these metal box, wooden box. Inside were 2 jars. One of them had a piece of plutonium metal. They said, that's our product. And the other one had plutonium oxalate, the powder which you generate before you get to the metal. So they wanted to tell me at that time, in January 2004, they wanted me to actually conclude that they have the bomb. And they said, in this conference room, they said, well, Dr. Hecker, we've now shown you are a deterrent. So I gave him that lecture that I just said. I said, you need 3 things. All I saw is this thing, it looked like plutonium. It actually felt like plutonium. It was warm. But I said, I don't have any, detection equipment here. I can't tell for sure. So then we went back in 2005, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And all of those have their own interesting story. But then what was really, the 7th visit was a really big surprise because, again, as Neil knows, that we thought that they acknowledged also having done uranium enrichment, the second path to the bomb to get you highly enriched uranium, that they acknowledged that in October of 2002 when Assistant Secretary James Kelly was over in Pyongyang. But from 2003 on, they denied having uranium enrichment, that they don't have any centrifuges, they don't have a program, they don't have people doing that. Well, in 2010, when I was back the last time, they showed me this modern centrifuge facility, 2,000 centrifuges, more modern than anything else in that whole nuclear complex was. So again, they're sending a message. So if we think of them as this dark hole in the universe, they actually have allowed that sort of a peak. Not only that, but since I haven't gone anymore, they show these kind of photos in their own, what they call Korea Central News Agency. And here's Kim Jong-un looking at what is a flow-forming machine. It turns out a flow-forming machine is what you need to spin and be able to make the rotors that spin and do uranium enrichment. So you do the flow-forming, get this rotor out of something like high-strength aluminum or high-strength steel, and off you are to try to make centrifuges. And he shows this. And we have some ideas by looking at the machine, where it came from, and so forth. So again, they're showing you that. Okay, so that gives you an idea that we do have an idea what they actually have. And based on my visits, my discussions, and everything else we know, I've put together this what. So what do they have? So in plutonium, I just show you what you have to go through. You mine uranium, you have to fabricate fuel, you got to operate a reactor, you got to extract the plutonium in a reprocessing facility. That's a chemical process. And then you'd have to fabricate and machine the plutonium. So the best I can put together, my estimate, is we know quite certainly that even if they operate the reactor all year, the most they can make is 6 kilograms of plutonium per year. That's more or less one bomb's worth. Just to give you an example, Nagasaki, which was a plutonium bomb, was around 6 kilograms. So the total inventory, the way we put it together today, is somewhere between 20 and 40 kilograms by the end of last year. We have quite high confidence that's in that range. And the observability is quite high because when the reactor operates, you have a signature that you can pick up from overhead. So we know when the reactor operates. We know all the design parameters about the reactor. I've been there, others have been there. You can calculate it, and you come up with how much they made. Then the reprocess, we know when they reprocess because there's a heat signature. You estimate how much loss they may have. And then you also try to estimate what tests, which I'll tell you about in a minute, were actually plutonium. So you come up with a number like this. Then you get to highly enriched uranium. Again, you start with uranium ore, but now what you actually do, you don't have to produce the plutonium. You just have to throw the uranium-238, which is 99.3% of natural uranium today. You have to throw it away and concentrate the 235, which is the fissile isotope that works for a bomb. Well, that you do, first you have to turn it into a gas so that the gas you can spin real fast and separate the heavy stuff from the light stuff. And you do that in these rows of cascades, these centrifuge cascades. And one of the tricky parts that all the people in here have ever worried about proliferation is that those same centrifuges can make and produce low enriched uranium that you put into commercial light water reactors, 3 to 5%, or they can make sort of the medium grade up to about 20% for research reactors. But the same centrifuges just plumbed a little differently, operate a little differently. If you keep going, you make 80, 90%, and that's bomb grade stuff. So it's the same stuff, the same capability. This was the whole big deal about Iran. It was that they built what they said was this big bank of commercial centrifuges. They said they're only doing it for reactors, but the thing is they could also do it for bombs. The problem now with the centrifuges is when I went into that facility in 2010, I think it's fair to say that essentially nobody outside of North Korea knew that they would have centrifuges in that building. I had been in that building 15 months earlier, and it had something totally different in there. And now, within that time frame, they built this centrifuge facility. So does that mean U.S. Intel community is terrible? It doesn't. It just means this is hard to find. It is really hard to find. You can put this, into tunnels. You can put it in lots of places. You just can't find it. So that's why then we go and estimate. And my estimate here, that's, it's really a tentative estimate. It's based actually on a pretty fancy probabilistic study of what components they may have acquired from different places, what components they can make themselves, and we come up with about 150 kilograms per year. And let's just say here for highly enriched uranium, it's not as potent a bomb fuel as plutonium, so it might take around 25 kilograms. So the inventory that I guess estimate there is 250 to 500, but my confidence is low, and the observability is very low. There essentially is no observability from the outside. So this is tough. So whenever you hear somebody giving you estimates as to how many bombs the North Koreans have, you've got to ask the question, how confident are you? So as I'll tell you in a few minutes, I'm going to give you a number. I don't have very great confidence in that number. The tritium, the part for the hydrogen bomb, which we didn't worry much about early on because we thought we're not even sure these guys can get to an atomic bomb. A hydrogen bomb would be more difficult. But as I'll show you, the last nuclear test was most likely a hydrogen bomb. And as we go back and look at do they have the ability to make tritium, yes, it turns out you also make tritium in a reactor. So if there's no reactor operating, there's no tritium. So they have the capability. They have a couple of reactors. We think they were most likely made in the same reactor that they make the plutonium, the so-called 5 megawatt electric. The tritium extraction, we know they know how to do that. We also can identify some buildings where we think they've done that. Lithium deuteride, we're also quite certain they can make that stuff. So, but the overall capacity, we think at this point, is low. The inventory is, I would say, not known. Maybe at best for a couple of bombs. That's sort of the best we can guess, but not great confidence. Okay, so having said that about the first part, the second part, the weaponization, we know even less because they never let me into their bomb factory, as you might imagine, or never showed me a bomb. There, we look at all those capabilities, and we more or less, and the intel agencies had also concluded, look, they know how to do all of these things well enough to be able to make a bomb. But the bottom line is, if you do a nuclear test, and of course these days one does underground nuclear tests, they have done 6 nuclear tests. And when the ground shakes, that means they know how to produce a device. And that's what happened. So just, again, Bruce, you have to forgive me. These are the cartoons, because that's all you can do in the open world. So those are the 3 type of bombs. The first one we call the gun assembly. That only works for highly enriched uranium. That was, in essence, it was the bomb used for Hiroshima. The plutonium doesn't work in that configuration. You have to assemble the plutonium much faster than in a gun. And so that was done in an implosion device, also developed at Los Alamos during the war. And that was Nagasaki. Hiroshima was around 15 kilotons explosive yield, and Nagasaki was 21. And then below is the cartoon for a hydrogen bomb. And we've never figured out, at least as of today, how to make peaceful fusion, for electricity. But it turns out, particularly Edward Teller, who was already on this project during the Manhattan Project during the war and right afterwards, then they figured out that if you use a fission bomb, like let's say the one in the middle, and you sort of drive the energy down, and then you can fuse the light isotopes, namely the isotopes of hydrogen. And that's what this cartoon is. So that's how a hydrogen bomb works. What's important about a hydrogen bomb? In essence, it has sort of unlimited yield capability. But typically, the bombs that have been tested over the years may be in the megaton regime, although the Russians actually tested one at 50 plus megatons. That was designed for 100 plus megatons. And that was mostly for political purposes. So that's what we think that they would also go towards. It looked right to us, right from the beginning, that they skipped that first one because they didn't start with highly enriched uranium. They started with plutonium, and that means you have to go to the second design. And then, indeed, again, here is what the North Koreans want you to see. And here's Kim Jong-un looking at what some people have called the disco ball. Well, this thing looks a little bit, like that second diagram I showed you. It's round. The important part of this is its size, because the message he's trying to get across is, look, this thing is small enough to fit into one of our missiles, and so you guys better pay attention. So we try to figure out how big is it. Well, the analysts say, all right, we know how big around Kim Jong-un is. And then if we compare that, it's about 60 centimeters. That's pretty small, so that's pretty good. So that was pretty impressive. At least that's what they wanted us to know. So then the nuclear test history, I'll just go over that very quickly. First one didn't work so well in October of 2006. The second one, once they got 2 to 7 kilotons, I said, if they can do 2 to 7, they can do 20. The third one you can see here, 7 to 14. Important part about that, now you're up at Hiroshima level. So what that means is, remember Hiroshima, one bomb, one plane, one city destroyed. So they have that capability. So if they have one small enough to put in what they call their Scud or no-dong missiles and reach all of South Korea and Japan, or most of Japan, they can do that sort of damage. So that's when you have to take them serious. Then they went on in 2016, they did one again, 7 to 14 kills. They called that one a hydrogen bomb. Most of us in the business said, well, it doesn't look like a hydrogen bomb, that yield is not enough. But it could easily have been proof of principle of a hydrogen bomb. In other words, those principles that I showed you, front end driving a back end, it could have been that. And then September 2016, they did one in that 15 to 25, and they claimed it was miniaturized. And so probably that one was a step towards miniaturization. And then the big one, a bit more than a year ago, it looked initially more 100, 150 kilotons, but more and more it looks like it was above 200 kilotons. And so for that one, it's quite possible that that was indeed a hydrogen bomb. And in fact, that's what they wanted us to know, because this again is a photo they showed. They showed this photo actually a couple of hours before the actual test, and they said, this is a modern two-stage thermonuclear, meaning hydrogen bomb. So indeed, whether they tested this, we have no idea. But they certainly want us to think that's what they tested, because again, that would be small enough to fit into missiles where we would be concerned, even if their ICBM reach. Okay, the third part, the missiles, I'll just briefly tell you, they have that whole spectrum from the very short-range missiles to ones that are potentially nuclear capable, like these Scuds and no-dongs that can reach up to 500 and 1,000 kilometers. And then in recent years, they've shown the capability to have ICBM-class missiles. In other words, to reach the United States. And the Hwasong 15, the missile guys will tell you that the way they launched these, they wanted to keep them close to North Korea. So they did what's called a lofted trajectory. So they went up high, very high, came down short, instead of going out low, to the United States. But if you do the missile calculations to say, okay, if they were able to launch one that high, they can reach New York City, for example. It's another issue that I'll touch on in a minute, whether they have a nuclear warhead that can fit on one of those that they can actually deliver. But they showed the basic missile technologies. In terms of missile testing, which is what you have to do, you have to test the missiles. And in the US program, over the years, you find out that the failure rate was pretty large at the beginning of the development of new missiles. Their failure rate is actually surprisingly low, which makes most of the missile guys actually conclude they not only had help early on, which we know they did. I mean, they got all that early technology from the Soviets, no question about that. But these latest, particularly large number of tests with very few failure rates, except for one of their missiles, which was a solid fueled called Musudan, that failed like 6 out of 8 times, maybe even 7 out of 8. The other ones had very few failure rates. And you don't do that unless you're still getting some help. And so the general sense is they're still getting rocket motors from somewhere, or they bought a whole bunch of them that they're now putting into service. But they have a remarkable record. And you can see how many tests they did. And this is a bit of a preview of where we are today. So you can see 2017 was a banner year. So how many tests in 2018? 0. None. So, something happened somewhere, and at least that's part of diplomacy. So that was 0. But it gives you an idea of the missiles. So summarize all of that in terms of what? I told you plutonium, highly enriched uranium. Not much. By the way, the comparisons here, if you would compare this to Russian, Soviet holding of plutonium and highly enriched uranium together at the end of the Cold War, they had somewhere around 1.4 million kilograms of this stuff. And by the way, we were no slouchers. We maybe had 800,000 kilograms or something like that. So this is totally different. But as I told you, 6 kilograms of plutonium, one bomb, one city destroyed. And so this is serious stuff, even though they don't have much. But we have to understand that. Tritium, as I said, very limited. So at the end of last year, I estimate sort of 25 to 30. You can read a whole bunch of estimates. Some have claimed that the Intel community, that they were able to get leaks from the Intel community of 60. So people say maybe 20 to 60, and 20 may be right, and 60 may be right. We just don't know. So my best guess is 25 to 30, and they can make maybe 6 or 7 a year. So by the end of this year, I'll change that number to more likely to 35. Can they deliver them on a Scud and Nodong? I'm afraid at this point we have to say they've done enough nuclear tests, enough missile tests, they probably can. So all of South Korea and most of Japan are within reach. So as far as I'm concerned, these North Koreans already have a deterrent. Because not only are South Koreans and Japanese threatened, but there's some 200,000 US citizens that live in South Korea, 28,000 troops, and also a lot in Japan. So then when you get to intermediate range, or ICBM, these Hwasong 12, 14, 15, they've demonstrated they have the basic rocket technology to do that, but I just do not see how they could have any confidence they can put one on a missile and deliver it. Because in other words, you have that big rocket that I showed you, you have to survive the launch, the space trajectory, and then the fiery re-entry. And to be able to do all of that with the few tests that they have, they've never even done one missile test, the normal trajectory. They've never measured all the conditions that are inside of that missile and its re-entry, that the warhead would have to be able to survive. It's just not there. Some people will say, well, maybe they don't take this as serious as we do. They just take a chance. Maybe. I don't think so. I mean, you don't fool with nuclear weapons, and I think the North Koreans know that also. However, as I'll show you, Kim Jong-un said they're now done. They've accomplished that. So I'm going to take you through this. This is actually sort of the piece I'm fondest of, is this study that we've done on how did this whole thing develop? And in the end, how in the world did these guys get this nuclear capability? They're supposed to be this backward country. So what Elliot, Bob Carlin, and I have done is said, okay, look, we'll take a look and follow 26 years, the trajectory that you see here. We'll take a look and see what U.S. has done in terms of diplomatic activity to reach out to the North Koreans. We'll see what North Koreans have done. We'll see whether that diplomacy has actually resulted in boots on the ground in Yongbyon, in their nuclear complex, because that, to me, is one of the most important things, is whether we have eyes and boots on the ground. So that's the left side of the line. On the right side, then we just go back and we try to do the best job going back now, and it helps us to be looking back and sort of reconstruct. What about the plutonium, uranium, tritium, weaponization, nukes, and missiles all the way through? And since I'm told that people in Washington don't read, and some of them like killer graphics, so we said, okay, look, they're not going to read all of this, Elliot, Bob Carlin, and I, we developed narratives for each of those boxes, some 77 pages. We track the history, we lay it all out. But now we said, in order to get the message across, why don't we try to do this in color? And so we're going to show this. Green is good, 3 shades of green. The darker, the better. Red is bad, from our standpoint. The darker the red, the better. So we're going to do this. I'm going to run you through this quickly. And on the website at CSAC that I had there, you can follow this whole thing, and you can look at the individual boxes. So this is the Clinton administration, after George H.W. Bush for his last year. So in the Clinton administration, there is a lot of green up there. It wasn't all wine and roses. There were a few times when things actually, not supposed to do that. Go backwards. Can't I don't have a pointer. But you get the idea. What you see here, there's a lot of green. The so-called agreed framework that Clinton administration struck with the North Koreans resulted in boots on the ground, resulted in the plutonium program being frozen, and actually the plutonium program going backwards significantly because they also had 2 bigger reactors being constructed. And in the end, even though we didn't know it right away, those reactors died. They died. So they never finished those other reactors. They would have had significantly greater plutonium capacity. Uranium enrichment, and as you look back now and people talk about the history, you see it went pink. And even at the beginning, it was a G1. It wasn't a G3 because they were playing with uranium enrichment. And when I talked to the North Koreans, I said, of course I know you're doing enrichment. We all did. You know, you have 2 paths to the bomb. You explore them both, and then you see which one works. They said, no, we didn't do uranium enrichment. I said, I know you did. And then by the mid-1990s, they got more serious. And indeed, our intel agencies started tracking these guys. They're buying stuff all over. They're hooked up with AQ Khan from Pakistan. And so they're exploring uranium enrichment. So it's only an R1, but they're exploring it. Tritium, again, a G1. They were certainly playing with tritium, but nothing serious. Weaponization, it never went green, even though the plutonium went green. So my view is, so they, in the 80s, we're very certain they already had bomb designs. They had done cold tests. They had a nuclear weapons effort. They never sent those designers home during the agreed framework. That's for sure. So that's why it's R1. But the nuke summary is for the most part green because they didn't take the plutonium out. The plutonium was sitting there. And then the missiles, they didn't get very far. And then actually in 1999 and 2000, as a result of what's called the Perry process, and actually Harold was there, I think, during those earlier days, they had a missile moratorium. So, and by 2000, this is the time when Vice Marshal Cho actually came to the White House. Madeleine Albright went to shake hands with Kim Jong-il in Pyongyang. And the North Koreans thought that, hey, we're just about there. But they were hedging their bets, by making sure that they had a uranium potential path for the future. In comes the Bush administration. And so the Bush administration, as you can see on the U.S. diplomacy, they went red pretty quickly. And there were, some of the strongest voices in the administration said this was the worst deal ever made, the agreed framework. And so indeed, they were against the agreed framework. The North Koreans initially didn't quite figure out, what's going on, so they went from G2 to G3 to G2. Inspectors were still there the first 2 years, but then, particularly after this altercation in Pyongyang in October of 2002, North Koreans threw out the inspectors, restarted their reactors, reprocessed the fuel rods, as they had shown me, and it turned to R3 because at that time, our estimate would be they could have extracted like 25 kilograms of plutonium. So they could have had enough for maybe 5 bombs. Uranium enrichment, they kept working on it, but my general estimate didn't get very far, but they're working on it. Tritium, I think at that point they got a little more serious to start making some in the reactor once they got that restarted. Weaponization, goes darker. But then in 2007, 2008, last 2 years of the Bush administration actually tried to reach out diplomatically to the North Koreans. And actually one hand of the Bush administration did. And they signed what's called the 6-party joint statement on September 19, 2005, where they had agreed to open things back up and to stop the plutonium production again. However, at the same time, the Treasury Department slapped sanctions on the North Koreans, what were called the Banco Delta Asia sanctions, and the North Koreans said, hey, you're not playing this right, and we're out of here. And so they weren't terribly interested. Bush administration, this was 2005, Bush administration came back in 2007, 2008, and actually got the North Koreans to say, okay, look, we'll open up Yongbyon again. We'll let the inspectors back in, and agreed to disable their facilities in return for the U.S. Helping them with fuel and other things. However, then by 2008, at least our own estimate is, when Kim Jong-il suffered a terrible stroke in August of 2008, I think that was the point when the North Koreans decided they're out of there. And so 2008 sort of faded out. Chris Hill, who was running the talks for the US, tried like the dickens to get somewhere with the North Koreans, didn't. So at that point, then President Obama comes in. So he comes in, and it turns out the North Koreans essentially hit him right between the eyes, starting saying they're going to do a space launch. And President Obama said, no, you can't do a space launch. We're going to consider that a missile launch. They did a space launch. UN sanctioned them. They did the second nuclear test, which I believe they really had to do, and they knew they had to do that second nuclear test. So they greeted Obama rather roughly, threw the inspectors out again during the early part of 2009. And then I won't go through the whole history, but it's a sad history, because essentially the Obama administration never got anywhere. They tried a couple of times. There were a few opportunities that I thought that they had, but they didn't get there. On the right-hand side, on the second to last column, you see the mushroom clouds, and that's when the tests happened. So that's where we were in 2017. In comes President Trump. And he could have said at that point, hey, look at this mess. Look at what I was handed. This stuff is all red. This is terrible. I'm going to do something about it. Well, it turns out it sort of went worse from there, and it was all red at that point. So what we tried to assess then, and again, I'll have to do sort of the quick version of that. I think we've done better on the website, is how could this happen? How could these guys right under our noses do all of this development? None of the diplomacy seemed to work. So my conclusion, the first is, I show the Kims on the left-hand side, the great leader Kim Il-sung, followed by Kim Jong-il, the father of the current Kim Jong-un. These guys were determined. And as we look back, diplomacy at times halted their drive towards nuclear weapons, sometimes went backwards somewhat. It certainly did for plutonium during the agreed framework. But never did they give it up. They were determined to make sure we stick with this. We have the option that we can go ahead and build that bomb. And not only build the bomb, but continue to sort of up what they considered their deterrent. So they were determined. And indeed, it's really interesting as I've watched them watch the evolution of what they thought was their deterrent. So in 2004, they showed me this piece of plutonium. That's what they called their deterrent. So just the fact that they showed the Americans they can make plutonium, they felt that was the deterrent. Well, that evolved, and here are photos from that visit. That evolved to, by the end of last year, they had this big ICBM. And Kim Jong-un said, we can deliver a nuclear weapon with that ICBM. Now that's what he said was a deterrent. And it sort of evolved over the years. So the other thing that happened, we also studied, so what role did the imports and exports play on their program development over the years? And those are the right two columns. The farthest is export, the one inside is imports. And again, we tried, and we lay all of this out on the website. We define what makes an R1, an R2, and R3. So we used a rigorous methodology to go through that. The bottom line is they've imported the whole time. There's no question. They're still importing things today. They've actually exported, which to me was some of the most troublesome times with the North Koreans. They sent this UF6, the uranium hexafluoride, to Libya. And that was only to make highly enriched uranium for Gaddafi, which then he gave up. And they built a reactor for Syria that was close to going to operations before the Israelis wiped it out. So those were really egregious. And actually the peculiar part, this is where if any time the US should have taken them to task, that was the time they should have taken them to task. We didn't do much. Then, as you can see, the dark red on the right actually turns less dark red. Not because they don't want to export, but it just became somewhat more difficult. But the bottom line, as much as they have exported and imported, their program is, for most part, is indigenous. I mean, they built these bombs themselves. They built the centrifuges themselves. They built the reactors, even though they had the drawings from the UK. The reprocessing facility they built themselves, but they had the drawings from Belgium. These guys have been incredibly clever of putting these pieces all together. To some extent, you'd almost have to admire, their capabilities of how they were able to use an international system. But they know how to do this. Now, here's sort of my criticism, and that's what I continue to fight, to this very day and hour, is it's all about politics in this country. It's not risk-based decision-making. Because quite frankly, to me, one of the worst decisions was the Bush administration decision to go ahead and walk away from the agreed framework. That's that first blue line up here. Walk away from the agreed framework because they found out the North Koreans were cheating. They called it cheating, but they were certainly cheating the spirit of that agreement. They were pursuing uranium enrichment and they were ratcheting up that capability. And so they walked away. To me, that's very poor risk-based because they traded a threat that would have taken 10 years to materialize for one that took the North Koreans 6 months to build a bomb out of plutonium. That's not a good change, a good trade-off for me. And so, to me, it really looked like they walked away, and it's their prerogative to walk away, but you have to be prepared for the consequences. And maybe Neil can enlighten us later, but that to me was not good consequence management because the North Koreans did walk away and they built the bomb. But this isn't about Bush administration bashing. Obama administration made a couple of similar, just drastic mistakes. In 2012, there's this very famous thing that, for those of you who follow North Korea, called the Leap Day Agreement, where during Kim Jong-il's sort of last month or so before he died, in December of 2011, the Obama administration actually started to put together a deal with the North Koreans. Then Kim Jong-il died, his son takes over, Kim Jong-un, and they keep the deal, and on February 29th, they presumably sign a deal where the North Koreans say, we're going to shut down plutonium, we're going to let you into this uranium facility, that Hecker saw. By the way, nobody else has seen that facility since. And by the way, it was my colleagues, many of you know John Lewis from Stanford, who's the guy who took me to North Korea in the first place. I mean, I never wanted to go to North Korea. It was John's fault. But so I wound up in North Korea. And so here, at this particular time, the North Koreans offer all of this up, but then in their version of this statement, they say, but we're going to do space launch. In the American version of this agreement, it says you can't do that. No missiles, no rockets. So we actually had two different statements. The North Koreans went ahead and launched a space launch, and it was clearly a space launch. And to that, again, the decision made by the Obama administration was, we're out of here. Well, you look at what happened after that line in 2012. Things really went bad. They only had 2 nuclear tests under their belt. They got 3 more during the rest of the Obama administration. That was a bad decision. Now you'd worry about, well, does a space launch teach them something about ICBMs? That's the same sort of question we're going to have now. Early on in 1998, when they did their first space launch, of course they learned something. Today, their ICBMs are so far advanced compared to their space launch vehicles that it's a whole different story. In 2015, again, Kim Jong-un made a similar offer to halt the nuclear testing and missile testing in return for not doing the war games. That was rejected right away. Then comes 2 nuclear tests. Then came President Trump. So these are the things that happen. Also, I should say, in addition, we also track the sanctions over all of these years. And North Korea has been sanctioned forever, in essence. Since North Korea used to make a real mess in the 60s and 70s. I mean, they were terrible. The Pueblo incident, they went and assassinated president's wives down in South Korea. They shot airliners out of the sky. I mean, they were terrible. So they were sanctioned the whole time. But as we look at, particularly as the sanctions have increased, you would think that if the sanctions go red, the missiles and the nukes should go lighter red or green, but they don't. So sanctions, at least through 2017, didn't have the effect that we had hoped. In fact, even if you add the North Korea economy, and again, by the way, I had people help me out in all of those areas because I'm not an expert on the North Korean economy. So we had a color shading for North Korea economy. And because it's light green now doesn't mean it's great. It just means it's a hell of a lot better than it was in the 90s. And so the sanctions and the economy don't even give you the right effect. You know, sanctions went up and the economy got better. Of course, there were different reasons for that, but there's no direct correlation. US and South Korea, you know, you would think the two should have been working together. And for the most part, again, just show you the colors, we've been out of phase for the most part. You know, South Koreans go with sunshine policy, we turn to something else. It just hasn't been coordinated. Then one other piece that's been used a lot, and particularly at the beginning of the Trump administration, let China do it. You know, China is the guy. They hold the key about everything that North Korea does. They can put the screws on North Korea, they'll behave. Well, we looked at China, you know, North relations, and then we looked at that related to the nuclear program. What is it saying? China has a lot less influence than we think. And in fact, what's really not appreciated, that's really played out now in the last 8-9 months, is really the North Koreans hate the Chinese. They because of historical reasons, you know, going back for a couple of thousand years, they hate the Chinese. And particularly today, they hate to be totally dependent on the Chinese for their avenue out to the external world and for economic help. So they don't want the Chinese. They don't want to depend on the Chinese. So having us rely on the Chinese is actually not a winning strategy. So, and that goes for a North Korean economy, even there. Okay, so let me take you, see how we're doing on time here. I'll race through this even faster. So I just want to make the point, 2017 was a bad year. It was a dangerous year. You know, that's where Trump made his total destruction. And this is Lee Young-ho, a foreign minister who I actually met during my 2010 visit before I dealt with Vice Minister Kim Kye-gwan. And he said, hey, look, you know, we're going to have a rocket that's going to reach your country, and essentially that blood is going to be on your hands if you talk like that, you Americans. So that looked bad. But then, you know, starts 2018, and all of a sudden we see a different Kim Jong-un, or so it appears. You know, he said, hey, look, he's going to turn his attention to the economy. And actually, if you go back, and those people who study North Korea very deeply, like Bob Carlin, my colleague, will point you to a March 2013 speech that Kim Jong-un gave about the importance of the economy, how it's got to do things differently than his father. So he said that, and by the way, we're going to participate in the Olympics. And of course, President Moon from South Korea was already reaching across for a whole bunch of reasons. That's his own instinct. But also, he didn't want the Olympics ruined, you know, by the North Koreans. So he reaches out. Kim Jong-un says, I'm coming. And you get this. You know, and for those of you who've watched the Olympics, I mean, it was dramatic, absolutely dramatic. You know, to have the Koreans march in as together, North and South, with one unified flag. And then on top, on the upper left, on top, is the senior person from North Korea Parliament, and then Kim Jong-un's sister. And they are applauding like crazy. As are President Moon and his wife. Now, the U.S. government was represented by Vice President Pence. He didn't seem to be overjoyed by all of this, judging from the look. But the rest were. And this changed everything. I mean, it changed everything. It led to the first Kim-Moon summit. And I like photographs. You just look at the photograph on the lower right. Do these two guys look like two guys, you know, that are carrying out 70 years of enmity and war against each other? There's something, some spark, something happened, as you can see. So the North and the South, you know, are off to the races. But what about the United States? You know, President Trump said he's going to destroy them. Well, that changed. And as probably only President Trump can do. I mean, he just did a quick flip around, and in Singapore, he met with Kim Jong-un. In my opinion, he doesn't get credit for the enormous potential positive impact that that meeting had. And the positive impact that it had. Today, the concern about war, as I go around and I ask, actually, let me ask the question here. So how many of you right now are concerned about getting nuked by the North Koreans? How many of you in this audience? 1, 2, 2, okay. 2. In my class that I just taught a week or so, I got 0 out of 200. So I got 2 out of 100 some here. Last year, it was typically about 75% of the people worried about it. And so things have changed. And they changed because of Moon Kim and because of Trump Kim. And then again, just to show, so they went on and they signed this summit agreement. I'll come back to that. I mean, there were many of us, including me, who had hoped for a lot more. But at least we got this much, and it was the agreement. But just to show you how clever this Kim Jong-un is, he not only got Trump to come to Singapore, he went to China 3 times. And the Chinese President Xi Jinping had absolutely no use for Kim Jong-un. Just wouldn't meet with him in his first 6 years in office, would not meet with him. And now in 2018, he met with him 3 times. And this on the right-hand side, that's Lavrov from Russia. Putin wants to come. Abe from Japan wants to come. So this Kim Jong-un being, he was this culprit, he was this terrible guy, and now he's got all these world leaders at his feet. It's pretty amazing. So here was the declaration, which gets us to, so where are we today? And as you can see here, the first, the second, and the third, the first, second, and the last, are sort of what I would put in the normalization. Normalization meaning developing normal relations, different relations. And you can see, U.S. committed to establish new U.S. DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, relations. Second one, building a lasting and stable peace regime. We're committed to that. Fourth one, return to POW, missing in action. So good stuff, 3 of them. Then the third one is sort of this denuclearization. And somehow, Kim was able to get away with saying he commits to work toward complete denuclearization. But so there's 1 denuclearization, 3 normalization. Now, so that was June 12th. And of course today, you read the pundits and they all say, we're all going backwards. These guys, they keep building missile bases, they keep doing plutonium, they keep doing all of these things. It's terrible. Well, so I put all this together and say, so where are we today? Well, in 2017, if we look at the threat as being what capability do they have and what's their intent, it was bad. The risk of war, even I thought, was high. 2018, as we look at this, with the Singapore summit, with the second Moon Kim summit actually in Pyongyang, it's changed completely. So the threat of war, because of these meetings, has dropped dramatically. And so this is where my opinion now is, because of that drop, it's bought us sort of space and time for diplomacy. Maybe this is the space and time that you can actually take some chances and to see whether this young man is actually different, from his father, from his grandfather, whether they're actually serious about building up the economy. So how do we do this in an organized fashion? Because certainly, even though as much as I think President Trump did the right thing of meeting with Kim Jong-un at the Singapore summit, there's no indication that he's given any sense as to how we're going to methodically go forward from here. Because at first he said, and particularly, as I'll show you in a minute, John Bolton said, they got to get rid of everything right away. And a couple of weeks ago, President Trump said, I'm not in a hurry. This isn't going to get done right away. We don't know exactly where we're going. Now we're in the hard part. But it's important, I think, I give you all this background to try get you from, again, my perspective to see how did we get here. So what we tried to put together is to say, okay, what's it going to take to denuclearize? So we lay out everything from the nuclear weapons, the people, the nuclear tests, missile tests, plutonium, fusion fuels, enriched uranium, and making sure they don't export. So the predominant view in Washington, and this I think is John Bolton's view, they called it CVID, complete verifiable, irreversible dismantlement. By the way, irreversible. I told the Obama administration, I've told the Trump administration, don't use irreversible. The Manhattan Project was 27 months from not even knowing you can build a bomb to dropping 2 bombs. So clearly, things are not irreversible now, especially 75 years later. At any rate, the U.S. administration there for a while said, red means you can't have that. So everything's got to go, and it's got to go now. And so first was within a year, we can do this within a year. Next was certainly in President Trump's this current term, it's got to go. But, if you look at that, and then people also say they have to declare everything now and then eliminate everything. So that's equivalent to surrender. And the North Koreans have said, hey, look, by the way, Americans, we didn't surrender in this deal. It's not that you defeated us and we surrendered. We didn't surrender. So it's not only highly unlikely, it's just not going to happen. So my approach has been, the more important thing is take deliberate steps that reduce the risks. Okay, we've already done one with the summit, but now follow it up, because the capability so far that I showed, I forgot to say that, capability hasn't changed much. The intent has changed. Capability hasn't changed that much. They've not done some things, but they haven't gotten rid of any nuclear weapons. Okay, so what then strikes me, some of the historians at Stanford sort of remind me, there have been a couple of times in history when you look back and there was a country in tough economic straits like the Soviet Union, 1985, Gorbachev turns to his foreign secretary, Shevardnadze, and says, we can't go on like this. We've got to do something different. And then, of course, lots of things happen, including arms control, but the whole change of the system. And then F.W. de Klerk, very different circumstance in South Africa, also turns to his cabinet in 1991, and he says, we can't go on like this. And he gives up the nuclear weapons. So, as we look at today, perhaps we're at a moment something like that, where Kim Jong-un actually says, maybe it's not that we can't go on, because I think he can hold out for a couple of decades, he can starve his people some more, but he may well be saying, we shouldn't go on like this. Maybe there's a different path. And today, what makes that possible, I wouldn't have thought so a year or two ago, but it's that north-south reconciliation that really has the potential of changing everything. And in fact, this photograph is just, it's amazing. Here are the two of them on top of Mount Pektu, which is sort of the holiest of holy, or the northern holy. There's another southern holy, which I think Moon will take Kim Jong-un to if he visits on Jeju Island. So they're on top of Mount Pektu. This is right on the border of China, and they're holding hands. I was in China a month ago, and we were discussing North Korea with the Chinese, and sort of asked the Chinese, as they saw this, they said, those damn Korean nationalists, getting together. The Chinese are freaked out by this picture. They're worried. They know the North Koreans don't like them. And so things are on the way. So what we've proposed, even before this picture, is to say, look, you can't turn everything red immediately. In fact, eventually when you eliminate, and the red does mean eliminate, so if you look in this last column, we say you have to get there by first halt, then roll back the capabilities, then eliminate. And the red, those are the parts that have direct nuclear weapons influence. So you got to get rid of it. You can't keep the plutonium. You can't keep the plutonium producing reactor. A light water reactor, well, we can talk about that. Neil didn't like it back in the early 2000s, but that was a different time, a different situation. So one would have to discuss that. So the yellow means, well, so maybe we can manage that risk, and we ought to talk about that. And that could be the point of actual discussion. So just to take it a little farther, and I gave, before we ever published this, I gave it to the Trump administration, briefed it to the Trump administration. They called it the ketchup and mustard chart. So that's what we referred to it also. So we actually put a narrative in there and say, okay, hey, look, here are the sort of things, if you take these steps to get to that end state of getting rid of all those red things, maybe in that 10-year time frame, you'd actually have the ability to develop enough trust that you could get to a point where North Korea may actually consider giving up the bomb. So I'm asked today, will North Korea give up the bomb? And the answer is, I don't know whether he will or not. But to me today, the answer also is, maybe we should find out. And with the decrease in the tensions today, it may indeed be the time to find out. So that's the phased approach, is just put some words to what I just told you. But for the most part, if we ask, well, what are we going to do in return to North Koreans as they denuclearize? Well, every agreement we've ever signed with the North Koreans have had normalization and denuclearization. So you have to work those two together. And today, the most important part that the North Koreans want for normalization is relief of sanctions. Because if he's going to improve the economy, he's got to have some relief of sanctions. And so that's what we've laid out. That's what one could do. What's happened, however, since there wasn't a really close and good follow-up from the Trump administration, sort of no systematic follow-up from the Trump administration, that the things that have happened out there, in the news media, are just all bounced around, and most of it sort of criticizes Trump and his administration from the left and from the right. So almost no matter what he's done, it's not put in the context of a framework like the one that I just showed you. So for example, the way one could use that framework is to say, okay, so what have they done already? Well, what Kim Jong-un has said, I'm not going to do any more missile tests. Well, that was one of my first three that I would hope they would do. Second thing, he said, I'm not going to do any more nuclear tests. Okay, that's 2 out of 3. The third one was no more plutonium. Well, he hasn't done that one yet, but he never promised that, but that's where I want to go next. Highly enriched uranium is a little more problematic, but it's not as important as the plutonium for a whole bunch of reasons. And not only has he just said, I'm not going to do missile tests, he's actually closed up, or at least taken steps to close up the nuclear test site. And there's some questions as to how important that is. It would be good to get somebody else there besides the news media from the outside to see how much damage was actually done. But he took these steps, and I know from my conversations with a number of people, Kim Jong-un is enormously frustrated. He said, I've taken these steps. The Americans have taken no steps towards normalization, and all we get is criticized, and we get these skeptics in America. And that is indeed where we are today. So actually, one of the things that I've proposed to, can you actually ever verify that they've gotten rid of all of the nuclear weapon elements? And the answer is no. A bomb in a basement, a bomb in a bunker, plutonium, 6 kilograms someplace, there's just no way you can ever verify that. So to me, one of the things, and it might be worthwhile to try that today, is to actually say, if we go to the North Koreans and say, hey, look, we're going to help you convert your military complex to a civilian complex. Military nuclear stuff to civilian nuclear electricity, medical isotopes. ICBMs, you got to cut those up. But space launch, you want to do space launch? We'll consider that. Maybe first you get a ride on the Russian space launch vehicles. So if you do that sort of thing, then that's the red that I indicate here. Actually have the South and the US work with the North with boots on the ground in the North Korean nuclear complex. And then you'd have something like this, where the green and the eliminate part is actually turned into potential civilian use. Should we be there? I'm not so sure. Can we get there? I'm not so sure. Is it worth trying today to get there? I think definitely yes. So that's where we are today. Bob, I know I've gone on a long time. let me stop here. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
So the floor is open for questions. Please.
After your many trips, I imagine you'd be a very popular person when you got back. Could you talk about your debrief process? Were you debriefing much, for example?
I'm sorry, could I talk about?
Your debriefing process. Who would you meet with in the West?
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, it's really fascinating. Since I'm the nuclear guy, as I said, the first trip was Los Alamos. So the way I got there the first time was strictly because of John Lewis. So he had been doing track 2 diplomacy with North Korea. He did track 2 with China. They invited him back in 2003, late 2003, because, as I said, they withdrew from the non-proliferation treaty, they restarted the reactor, they took out the fuel rods, they built the bomb, and nobody seemed to give a damn. And so they were enormously annoyed, and they said to John Lewis, hey, why don't you come back? We're going to take you out to Yongbyon. We're going to show you something. John calls me up, and he says, hey, Sig, you got to go to North Korea. I said, I don't want to go to North Korea. I don't know. I do Russia, I do China. I don't want to go to North Korea. But John's persistent guy was. Unfortunately, we lost him about a year ago. So I went with John, and the way that it works, you go into Beijing. You actually get your visa in about 15 minutes at the North Korean embassy in Beijing. The next day, you fly Air Koryo on an Ilyushin 62, which is an adventure in itself. And you land in Pyongyang, and the foreign ministry meets with you first. And then they lay out your agenda for the next 4 days. Because you fly in on Tuesday, you fly out on Saturday. There's nothing in between, at least at that time. So we met with the foreign ministry guys, and since John had known these guys, then he actually also met with a number of other ministries besides the foreign ministry and the nuclear guys. But then that Thursday, they took us out to Yongbyon in a Toyota Land Cruiser. By the way, that we had to pay for. So we had to pay for the expense of the Land Cruiser. So we drove out there. And then I dealt with the nuclear folks out there. And quite frankly, I mean, it was an incredible experience. And I've been in the nuclear places of almost every country that has nuclear stuff. And these guys, they were so professional, professional, competent. And they, it was quite clear they had been told, look, you show Hecker enough that he can conclude that we have the bomb. And so he showed me all this stuff, explained. I had discussions on plutonium metallurgy, Bruce, that you would appreciate, about the density of the stuff that was there. And it was just incredible. And even a sense of humor, So it was really interesting. And then in subsequent visits, 5 and 6, I didn't get to Yongbyon. We just got to Pyongyang. 5, we met with Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but then we went out to the Ministry of Education. We went to schools. I actually have on here a lot of photos that if we finish 2 or 3 minutes before, I'll just quickly go through those. So we went out to schools. We saw musicals. We saw the Arirang. So it was incredible education, to actually see some of North Korea. Of course, they only showed us what they wanted to show us. That was pretty clear. But we did get out into the hinterlands, and, very, very poor. I mean, just no question. But Pyongyang, particularly, I'm told by people who still go there in the last 7 years, it's just amazing how it's built up. Yes, Bruce.
Let me ask you about pictures of the supposed weapons that they show, and the estimates of weapons numbers that you have here. It seems to me that those weapons that they picture are rather sporty for say, a non-booster weapon. You say they don't have much tritium. And therefore the amounts of plutoniums and uraniums don't arrive at the numbers that you say they could possibly have. So do you believe that those are actually the weapons that were tested? And oh, by the way, the hydrogen bomb looks phony.
It looks
Phony.
phony. Okay. Well,
It's sort of a Disney version of what you would think of miniature hydrogen bomb.
right. So as you well know, neither you or I can comment on the details. of any of that. So my own view, to answer your main question, is I don't think that's what they tested. And particularly on the hydrogen bomb, it's just, it's you could call it sporty or whatever, but if it's something of that size, quite frankly, I don't see how they could have got there by themselves. I mean, that is just one huge step. And it's the one place where I've actually worried about, inflow of information from other places. It turns out I've had those kind of discussions with the Russian nuclear people, with the Chinese nuclear people. They both said it didn't come from us. And of course I would say, well, it didn't come from us. Well, actually, none of us know in the end. But if they got anywhere close to that, they had significant assistance someplace. My own feeling is to get that 200 plus kilotons. It most likely was a hydrogen bomb. It could be something much cruder than that. And as you well know, I mean, you can make a boosted. Oh, sure, and you can make a boosted device. I think the highest boosted device was up on 700 kilotons or so without a secondary. So you can do that, and they could have gone to that. My general sense is when they told us hydrogen, my own, again, this is gut now. My own gut is, I think it probably was a two-stage thermonuclear. Probably nothing that was the size of this thing. And the other one, the disco ball, again, there's lots of strange things. That's pretty small, yeah. In terms of the boosting, my own sense is, again, this is guessing. My own sense is they've mastered the boosting and they can do that, and they've got enough tritium for a couple of those.
Sure,
But no, they don't have an arsenal. So I'm not worried about those arsenals. I just don't see how they can have it. Yes?
If I look into your green areas, they were pretty much what was agreed upon in mid-1990s under the Clinton administration. And at that time, if I remember correctly, it was promised that at least 2 commercial nuclear reactors will be built so that they could produce electricity and so on and so on. And then the next administration comes and says, no, it doesn't matter. So I know that you went many times trying to give good advice. So is there any hope in the future that any administration will actually accept advices of people that are really knowledgeable about these areas?
Well, so the answer is, will this administration or other administration accept advice? I don't know. I've tried to stay scientific advice for what it's worth. And of course, I've learned a lot about policy over the years, so I mix it in together. But I've tried to stay totally nonpartisan. So the good news is, when I started this in 2004, of course, I worked for lots of administrations before, and it didn't matter. I sort of would say, look, presidents come and go. I stay here for a long time, since 1965 at Los Alamos. I've been through 11 presidents, over that time. And whether they're Republican or Democrat doesn't care, it doesn't matter. I still, for whatever I do, I have to try to do the right thing for the country. And so the good news right now is I am in contact with the Trump administration. And I'm actually quite impressed with the people I'm working with right now. They're much better than what I was afraid of about a year or so ago. So they're actually people who have good sense. They have some people with very good knowledge about North Korea. But these issues then so quickly get into the political aspects. So obviously if I say, let them have this experimental light water reactor, then immediately you go back and say, my God, we've already went through that once and they cheated. So why in the world should we give them that now? Well, it turns out actually this experimental light water reactor, in my opinion, this thing is a loser. When I watched that thing come out of the ground, they were pouring the concrete with a garage cement mixer. As Per Peterson knows, you don't do nuclear concrete that way. So what I would do is I would actually put Per Peterson's first reactor from Kairos over there in North Korea, build them a small reactor. But I would not rule out. I tried to talk Vice Minister Kim Kye-gwan in 2005, when we had this big issue, and Neil knows that about light water reactors. You know, they had been killed, but then there was a question, could they be rejuvenated? And I came with a complete, beautiful presentation of why he doesn't need light water reactors. I told him he could get, fossil fuel electricity so much faster. We could help him. We could do all of that. He looked, and he's a wily character. He looked at me. He says, "Dr. Hecker, no LWR, no deal." And that's how I came back. So here now one has to factor in those sort of politics. Could one do some? For example, the easiest sale would be a research reactor to make medical isotopes. I've had all these discussions with their nuclear director. In 2007, 2008, when they were shutting things down, I said, Director Lee, what are you going to do with these thousands of people when you're shutting your facilities down? I said, I used to run Los Alamos. I'm worried about that. What are you going to do? And he tells me, we'd like to make nuclear electricity. He said, we need medical isotopes. We need iodine-131. The reason they need that, they crapped up the place enough, with their thyroid cancer problems, they need iodine-131. So one could have, for example, one possibility is have the South Koreans build the Hanaro small research reactor together, run it together with the North Koreans, make medical isotopes, sell them to South Korea as well. That's the sort of if you do that project, for 5-10 years, you can change the whole dynamics. Are they going to make plutonium with that reactor? Heavens, that's not right. The light water reactor, again, you take a chance. But today it's different. At that time we were worried about them making anything. Now they are ready. They have bomb-producing reactors. They have ICBMs. So it's not the same. Do risk. That's what I've tried to tell them. So the folks in the government actually listen, but then the politics come into play. So that's hard. Yes. Yeah. I got to get out of the light here.
Can you talk a little bit about your mustard and ketchup table and how does it align with the Trump administration's, if they were to see this and move things around, the declaration seems to be one which the Trump administration wants to see right off the bat, in certain aspects of this table. How would that align?
Yeah, so how could the Trump administration play with this? So one thing I've actually said, so try to get the North Koreans early on to front-end load. And that's actually what the blue is. That's front-end loading. I would have expected the halt is that first year of negotiations. They haven't started negotiations. They've already front-end loaded some of that, okay? The full declaration, as I just said, it's a loser. They're not gonna do that. We wouldn't do it. They're not gonna do it. So forget the full declaration. But what you could do then is you could think about, so how are you gonna, shrink this to less than 10 years? That's where I suggested this conversion concept. It would be the Hanaro reactor, maybe, that experimental light water reactor. I just don't see operating that. But if you operate it for a few years, it might work, but then you got a nuclear waste problem. Get them electricity piped down from Russia or something like that to take care of that. Space launch, I definitely would let them have satellites. And first have the Russians launch them and then have a joint South Korea, North Korea space launch capability. Those are the sort of things that would then, if they allow you to get boots on the ground back in Yongbyon, then you have a much better chance of verifying enough. And with the declaration, for example, what I would do right now, if I were in negotiation for what it's worth, I would say, okay, look, we understand why you're not going to give us a complete declaration. But Yongbyon, we know a lot of what's happened there. You at least ought to declare what you have in Yongbyon. You go ahead and declare, and then let's go through. And again, that process develops some confidence. Harold.
One thing you didn't touch on that might influence Kim's change of heart is that communication technology is spreading very fast. And no matter how tightly he controls his society, I believe that more and more North Koreans are getting a better and better idea of what life is like outside of North Korea. Is Kim feeling any internal pressure of that type?
So, very good question. If you didn't hear the question, what brought about Kim Jong-un's sort of change of heart? And the fact that more information is coming. Definitely that's part of it. He does not seem to be facing intense pressure from the inside. He's got that place in control. The economy has been improving, and in the end, with poor people, they look at the slope. Is it going up or is it going down? They're still, down 1/30th of the economy of South Korea. But if it's going up, there's some hope. So he actually, I think that part, more and more information is going in. There are more and more cell phones in North Korea, even though they have limited service, but people talk to each other. There's more and more barter has been across the Chinese, border. So they're getting more and more of that outside in. And I think in the end, he knows you can't eat nuclear weapons. And his biggest problem is indeed inside the country, and it's a bigger problem than the Americans. So I think he sees that. When people ask me what's all of a sudden given him, perhaps the confidence to come out like this. Well, of course, we don't know for sure. I mean, the highly enriched uranium, we have high uncertainty. And what Kim thinks, we have no idea, except we can take a stab at it. And so, what's so interesting, what's happened, the guy took control. As young as he was, like 28 years old, he was ruthless. I mean, he wiped out a whole bunch of people, including his uncle, maybe his half-brother, the way it looks. But he has taken control, and he's in firm control, and he's got quite good support. He's bringing the economy up, so that's good. Then in addition, you saw the missile tests and the nuclear tests. So he's actually gotten to the point where either he's convinced, or at least he has his people convinced, we have the strength to hold off the Americans. And so now we can turn to the economy. So those are a couple of the things. The other one that I can't rule out is for all of Trump's rhetoric, in 2017. So when Trump is there at the UN General Assembly and says, the rocket man is on a suicide mission, if I were Kim Jong-un, I would look at my advisors, and by the way, it appears that his closest advisor is his sister. I would look at his advisors and I would say, what in the world's that guy going to do? Is he actually going to come and attack us? We don't know. And so he must have scared the hell out of him to some extent, because it's just totally unpredictable. So all of 2017 he was walking up, he ratcheted up, and that must have had some influence in Kim deciding. Now, it was pretty high stakes, to go that way. Oops, I've gone over, I'm sorry.
So we're out of time now, so I'd like to thank Dr. Hector Sig for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you.